big question on my mind today is about institutions, whether our institutions are keeping up with the rate of social change around us globally, and whether, in fact, institutions are going to continue to keep up in the future. I suppose this is a question I've had on my mind for some time, and it keeps coming back in different contexts. And what brought it back particularly today was the economists' special interest this week on regulatory procedures, regulations, and the amount of red tape in America. But I think that's just one side of the problem, that our ability to manage the commercial activity and productive activity as the rate of innovation increases is in question. But also our political processes generally all over the world, both in Washington, because the government is not keeping up in Washington with the need to appoint people, nominate people, approve people for various committee activities. But obviously in other parts of the world, governments are not managing to keep up with the rate of social change. And that's just one way of looking at what's going on in the various Arab countries, apart from elsewhere. Well, only the Chinese seem to be confident that their institutions are keeping up.
Well, it's easier for them to do than others, I suppose, yes. This is another side of that same coin we were discussing last week when we were talking about how governments are dealing with increased intensity of globalization, especially insofar as information free flow. It seems as if the institutions and the government, in this case, talking about regulation, are always struggling to catch up. And I'm wondering, historically, is it so that governments and institutions struggle to catch up with the pace of social change, or is it sometimes the other way around historically?
I think ever since the 17th century, when our commercial activity and financial activity began to take off in a way that we now recognize as capitalism, there have been attempts to regulate the activity so that it remains relatively fair in a democratic society. And the attempt to regulate has never kept up with the ability to innovate. But when the rate of change was slower, we didn't notice. It didn't seem too bad. And it's just that over the last couple of decades, the rate of change has increased to such an incredible extent that it becomes very obvious, and there's an actual breakdown of the ability to manage what's going on. And that's, after all, really what happened at the end of the Bush term and the beginning of the Obama term with the current financial problem, and also, of course, in Europe.
Well, I think that's true. I, in the 1980s, worked in the House of Representatives for the House Energy and Commerce Committee, in which John Dingell at that time was chairing it. It was the committee in the House that probably had the widest remit of responsibilities. And even at that time, it was involved in things as diverse as inland waterways, pollution, telecommunications, insurance. I mean, it was mind-boggling as to the extent of its reach. Today, that exact same committee is struggling with issues ranging from sale of human DNA products, genomic coding, how that's to be marketed, how it's to be distributed. Essentially what happens is every single issue of commerce, because according to the Constitution, commerce is at the purview of the Congress, every single issue of commerce is divided up and apportioned somehow amongst the various committees in the Congress. So you can imagine what that's like in a workday week that's typically only 3.5 days, excluding the silly season during political times, where you have members who are involved in 4, 5, 6 different committees who are barely paying attention to issues as they come up, that, as the economist noted, are frequently being assaulted by lobbyists who are very well versed and knowledgeable about specific interests, who are coming in pushing their own agendas. It's an absolute morass, and it's a miracle that anything is ever done. And there's no denying the fact that it's inevitable that things are behind the curve insofar as regulations coming out following the events on the ground.
Now, I would say that the reason that things aren't keeping up is that we are still working within the same structure and trying to innovate within that structure. And so, I mean, the last big thing that happened, which I think isn't working, is the creation of the Department of Homeland Security. That is to bring a lot of things together into one enormous structure that would cover everything, which is analogous to what you've just been talking about. I think that that really is based on the premise that as things get more and more complicated, the structures we had in the past have to be enlarged so that they comprehend everything. And that assumes that eventually we're going to have a world authority that will regulate everything and particular world authorities to do everything else. And I think that there are very few people, even among optimists, who think that it's going to be possible to do these things on a global level. Because most of what's working at the moment, pretty much everything that's working at the moment, doesn't work on a global level. And the bigger the institution is, the more difficult it is to innovate within it.
I'm reminded of that famous meeting that came with one released picture that President Obama held out in California very early last spring, in which he sat down with Steve Jobs, Bill Gates, the fellow who started Facebook, Mark Zuckerman, I believe, and a number of other people, Larry Ellison from Oracle, and a few other folks were there, Sergey Brin from Google, and they were having a talk about how the United States could become more competitive in the field of information technology. And Obama had kept, it was a good-natured dinner apparently, because they mostly were all Democrats. And Obama was asking Jobs repeatedly, why don't you build a new factory in the United States? And Jobs was being fairly deferential. And I guess finally the president asked one too many times. So Jobs turned to Obama and said, it would take me 3 years to get the approval permits that I would need environmentally and everything else in order to be able to get the approvals to start a factory in the United States, and then another 3 years to build it. I can build the same factory in China, get the entire approval process and start production within 2 years. Now, that sort of deflated the whole conversation at that point. And when I read that at the time, I sort of said, well, okay, I guess that does make sense economically. But very shortly thereafter, the suicides began at the Apple Foxconn plants. Workers who had been essentially being on their feet for 3 and 4 days in a row, burnishing Apple computer products, saw no way out and began to jump out of top floor windows. And then since then, this whole issue has been discovered. And just last week, Apple published a code of conduct that all of their suppliers have to follow. So it's sort of an evening out process. There is no doubt that these large institutions, i.e. the government of China, can mandate certain things to occur. But how long does the backlash take? It might take generations, but sooner or later, those same types of things that Sinclair Lewis wrote about in the jungle back in the early part of the 20th century are going to begin to become manifest in China.
Yes, and I think that for that very reason, the ability of one CEO in California to regulate what's going on all over the world in a mammoth organization is probably not going to continue indefinitely, and things are going to be much more an issue of a more equal relationship between different cooperating units. And this is the sort of argument that one hears in Europe. You know, can there be a European authority that can control, say, 27 different political units, or would it be better, and this is the sort of thing that you would hear in England, if without the authority you had a better collaborative relationship between the units themselves? But actually the units need to be flexible in their organization as well, and the nation state obviously is not as flexible as is going to be needed. And now, I mean, so many of the political problems in the world have to do with the boundaries of nation states.
Mm-hmm.
People who have herded together in one particular nation state within boundaries that are strictly defined, and everybody's afraid of changing them in case if you change one, everybody will want to change theirs.
Mm-hmm.
Are competing within the current structure, and it's not clear how long they'll be able to compete without breaking down the structure.
Well, it's interesting, not to harp on this, but it's interesting that the Foxconn problems were made known to the West precisely because and due to the access flows of the globalization information explosion that we were discussing the last time. If this had been 25 or 30 years ago, no one in the United States or the West would have heard a thing about what was going on inside China. But in fact, what's happening now is Western reporters on the scene were contacted. They began to show up at the plants. They were denied entree. They began to interview workers at cafes and began to piece together the story. And then that story made its way out in the New York Times and on National Public Radio, and Apple was forced to respond. So that pressure, that globalization pressure, it's almost like it's a tautological discussion. We're back at the beginning again.
But the same things have been going on with clothing manufacturers in places like Pakistan for a long time, and nobody worries about what's happening to them because they don't have tall buildings that they can jump out of windows from.
Well, you're exactly right. But back 15 years ago, the Nike sneaker company was successfully boycotted because of child labor in Indonesia and Malaysia.
Yeah.
And then they did revise their practices. You're right. Of course, in the aggregate sense, or even remotely in an aggregate sense, this is sort of an impenetrable wall. But nevertheless, leaks have appeared, and there seems to be. I wouldn't want to be on the wrong side of this because it's inevitable that it's going to burst.
Well, the other side of this is the fact that in the West we pride ourselves on our institutions. Mm-hmm. The fact that in America, got a constitution that a group of very intelligent people wrote 200 years ago, and it still appears to work. Mm-hmm. That in other Western countries, we've got a whole array of institutions which govern the way everything works and give people confidence in they know what they can rely on, what they can depend on, how to maneuver engineer their lives, maneuver their way through it without worrying about insecurity and what's going to happen next. And it's the places that don't have this history of institutions that are changing faster than we're changing now, in which cities are growing faster than Western cities. And what we have to watch in the coming decades, especially I think the coming decade, the next 10 years or so, is whether the rate of innovation begins to increase in these new cities without the institutions and without the regulatory bureaucracy to the same extent or perhaps even greater extent than it does here. Mm. That really will make people here turn around and work out what they can do about the relationship between innovation and regulation.
Well, I think that's inevitable. And I think that there's a very popular book now that it's on the bestseller list about the name is going to escape me. It's written by a woman about the real situation in Mumbai. You may know the book. I'll think of it as soon as the broadcast is over.
I can't remember the name of the author.
Yeah. But it's attracted a tremendous amount of attention, and it's talking about the social stresses that exist on regular people and on families in Mumbai, simply because of the displacement from rural to urban and the incessant pounding pressure that's on people in order to produce money to purchase basic goods to survive.
No, and I wanted to draw attention to the fact that it's the commercial, business, financial innovation that has been in the news mainly this week, but it obviously applies to political institutions, and I think it applies just as much to medical institutions.
Oh, yeah.
And it may, in fact, be the medical side of things which gets most attention in the short run because of the amount of competition for medical treatment and for drugs that is now beginning to be global.
Tell me a little bit what you mean by that. Are you talking about competition insofar as medical tourism on the part of affluent
Medical
Westerners?
tourism and generic drugs, and the fact that regulation can only be managed within certain contexts, but now you can't control the availability anymore.
Mm-hmm. It would be a very, very unfortunate analysis to turn that telescope around in the other direction and look at the medical competition in the framework of necessary medicine being trickled down to the lower economic groups in the world.
Yeah. So my point is that I think institutions as a whole, established ways of doing things that everybody thinks they can rely on, and therefore that they have some sanctity, because if otherwise they wouldn't be reliable, is a basic way that we think about society, which is very different from the way people think about society in what we used to call the developing world. I'm suggesting that possibly we're going to outgrow this institutional framework, and the way we think about institutions is going to change.
Well, I think you're probably right, and I'm wondering what that actually means. Would that mean that eventually the situation would reach a point where, for example, in this country, people would sit down and go, all right, we're going to have a second constitutional convention. We're going to have to put something different together. It's going
to be the main contest in not this election, but some future election.
No, sure. I think you're right. I think you're right.
I think we've reached our limit for today.
All right, Professor, thank you. All right. Okay.